Blake sat in the living room, the TV on but ignored, as the early evening light filtered through the curtains. The day had been uneventful, work a quick dinner, and now the usual quietness of the house. He hadn't seen much of Kelly since she started working late nights, which had become more frequent in recent months. They barely spoke anymore, the silence between them growing heavier each day. As he reached for the remote to change the channel, the front door swung open with a loud creak. Startled, Blake turned to see a massive figure fill the doorway. The man was well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of presence that demanded attention. His face was rough, with a dark stubble that matched the intensity in his eyes. He walked in as if he owned the place, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. Without a word, the stranger strode into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and pulled out a beer. Blake watched, his confusion quickly turning to anger. Who the hell was this guy, and why was he acting like he belonged here? But before Blake could say anything, the man spoke. "Hey, loser." His voice was deep, laced with condescension. "I'm taking your wife on a wild night out. She's my toy now, and you can't say no." Blake blinked, trying to process the words. They felt like a slap to the face, knocking the breath out of him. "What the hell are you talking about?" he finally managed to say, his voice shaky. The man grinned, taking a long swig of the beer before tossing the bottle cap onto the counter. "Don't worry," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "I'll make sure she has more fun than she ever has with you." The taunt hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Blake felt his blood boil, his fists clenching involuntarily. He wanted to lunge at the guy, knock that smug look off his face, but something held him back. It wasn't fear. No, it was something deeper, a mix of shock and a growing realization that this wasn't just a sick joke. Before Blake could react further, he heard footsteps on the stairs. He turned and saw Kelly descending slowly, almost like she was on a runway. She wore a dress he'd never seen before, tight, red, and short enough to make him uncomfortable. Her hair was done up, her makeup more dramatic than usual. But what really struck him was the expression on her face. A smirk that was equal parts excitement and disdain. "Kelly, what the fuck is going on?" Blake's voice was barely above a whisper, laced with a desperation he hadn't felt in years. She paused halfway down the stairs, looking at him smirking as if he were a loser. "Today's going to be so much fun," she said, her tone light, almost playful. "I'm leaving, honey. We'll be back before breakfast if you're lucky." She reached the bottom of the stairs and walked over to the man, sliding her arm around his waist. He pulled her close, his hand settling possessively on her hip. The sight of them together hit Blake like a punch to the gut. This was his wife, the woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life with. And now she was standing there, wrapped around another man, acting as if he didn't even exist. "What the hell are you doing, Kelly?" Blake's voice cracked with emotion, but she didn't flinch. If anything, her smirk deepened. "Don't wait up," she said, her eyes cold, void of any affection. "And don't bother calling. We're going to places you wouldn't understand." The man laughed, a low, rumbling sound that made Blake's skin crawl. "Let's go, babe," he said, turning toward the door. "We got a long night ahead." As they walked out, Kelly didn't look back. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving Blake standing in the middle of the living room, his world crashing down around him. The laughter he heard outside was like nails on a chalkboard, each sound a painful reminder of how far things had spiraled out of control. Blake felt the walls closing in, his breathing shallow and rapid. But as the minutes ticked by, something in him shifted. The panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just about a betrayal. This was about something deeper, something that had been festering for a long time. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Blake stood motionless, the slam of the front door still echoing in his ears. The house felt emptier than it had in years, as if Kelly's departure had sucked the life out of it. He turned slowly, his eyes landing on the clock above the mantel. The ticking was loud, each second passing with a deliberate, taunting rhythm. He glanced at the couch where they used to sit together, the silence between them once comfortable, now suffocating. His gaze drifted to the window. He crossed the room, pushing aside the curtain with a trembling hand. Outside, he saw the man's sleek black car parked in the driveway, Kelly already seated in the passenger seat. She didn't look back. Not once. The car's engine roared to life, and they were gone, the taillights disappearing down the street like a fading dream. Blake let the curtain fall back into place and turned away from the window. He felt a hollowness in his chest, a deep, gnawing ache that had nothing to do with love lost and everything to do with betrayal. The image of Kelly in that dress, hanging on to another man, was seared into his mind. He moved to the kitchen, his steps heavy and uncertain. The remnants of their dinner still sat on the table, untouched. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it could anchor him to reality. His mind, however, was slipping, sliding back into memories he'd tried to bury. He remembered when they first met, the way Kelly's laugh had been infectious, how they'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. They'd had dreams back then, traveling the world, starting a family, growing old together. But somewhere along the line, those dreams had withered, replaced by routine and complacency. The passion that had once burned so brightly between them had faded, replaced by a cold, distant politeness that neither of them had dared to confront. Blake stared at the empty chair across from him, where Kelly used to sit. The sound of her voice, once a source of comfort, now echoed in his mind like a taunt. "We'll be back before breakfast if you're lucky." The words repeated themselves, over and over, each repetition driving the knife deeper into his gut. He pushed the chair back abruptly and stood up. The room was too small, too confining. He needed to move, to do something, anything to stop the relentless flood of memories and regrets. He paced the kitchen, his thoughts racing, circling back to the same question. How had it come to this? How had he let things slip so far? He knew the answer, of course. He had let the grind of daily life consume him. The late nights at work, the endless bills, the stress of making ends meet. He had lost himself in all of it. And in losing himself, he had lost her too. But self-blame quickly turned into something darker. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Kelly had made her choice. She had chosen to leave, to betray everything they had built together for the thrill of something new. She had chosen someone else, someone who made her feel alive in a way he hadn't been able to in years. Blake's pacing slowed as his thoughts crystallized. The pain, the sorrow, it all began to twist into something harder, something colder. The humiliation he felt, the image of Kelly with that man, it all demanded a response. But not just any response. It needed to be something more, something that would cut as deep as the wound she had inflicted on him. He walked to the sink and turned on the tap, letting the cold water run over his hands. The sensation grounded him, bringing a clarity that had been missing since the moment that man had walked into his home. Blake stared out the kitchen window, watching as the night settled in, the darkness deepening with every passing minute. His mind was no longer racing. It was focused, intent on one single thought: revenge. But not the kind of revenge that involved yelling or fighting. No, this had to be something more calculated, something that would shake them to their core. It had to be something that would haunt them, just as their betrayal haunted him now. Blake dried his hands and walked out of the kitchen, his movements deliberate. He headed down the hallway to the spare room, his office. It was cluttered with papers, bills, and remnants of the life he had tried to build. He ignored the mess, pulling open the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a small lockbox. He hadn't opened it in years, not since his father passed away. He found the key, hidden under a stack of old receipts, and unlocked the box. Inside, among old photographs and keepsakes, was a small handgun. It was something he had kept out of necessity, never out of desire. Blake lifted the gun out of the box, feeling its weight in his hand. He wasn't a violent man. He had never been in a real fight in his life. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't the man he used to be. He had been pushed too far, and something inside him had snapped. He stood there in the dim light of the room, the gun in his hand, and made a decision. The old Blake was gone, buried under the weight of betrayal and heartbreak. What remained was someone who wasn't going to sit quietly and let this happen. He was going to make sure that Kelly and her lover understood the full extent of what they had done. Blake put the gun back in the box, locked it, and placed it back in the drawer. He wasn't sure when or how he would use it, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He moved with a purpose that was almost clinical, his mind detached from the emotions roiling beneath the surface. The night stretched on, silent and oppressive, but he barely noticed. His focus was razor-sharp, his actions deliberate. He wasn't a man of violence, not naturally, but desperation had a way of transforming even the most mild-mannered into something else. Something colder, more calculated. He began by picking up Kelly's phone, which she had carelessly left charging on the kitchen counter. He unlocked it easily. After years together, her passcode was no mystery to him. Within minutes, he had installed a tracking app, something simple but effective. He knew she wouldn't notice. It would run quietly in the background, unseen. He smiled grimly at the thought. She'd never been much for technology anyway. Next, he turned his attention to the stranger, the man who had brazenly walked into his home, taken his beer, and claimed his wife. Blake had memorized the guy's license plate as they drove away. It was a small detail, but it was enough. He knew people who could dig up information, no questions asked as long as the price was right. Blake wasn't wealthy, but he had enough savings to make this work. A quick phone call to an old acquaintance, some cash transferred discreetly, and within hours, he had the man's name, address, and more. The next step was the basement, a space that Kelly had always avoided. Too cold, too dark, too musty. She had never liked it, which suited Blake just fine. It gave him a place to think, to work, and now to prepare. The basement was already filled with tools, remnants of his various home improvement projects, but he needed more. He made a quick trip to the 24-hour hardware store, picking up items that felt oddly mundane considering what he intended to use them for. Chains, a heavy tarp, duct tape. He paid in cash, not wanting to leave a trail. The cashier didn't even look up, too bored or tired to care. Back home, Blake methodically arranged everything in the basement, laying out the tools with a precision that bordered on obsession. He tested the chains, making sure they were strong enough, secured them to the heavy beams that lined the ceiling. The tarp was spread across the floor, the duct tape within easy reach. Everything had to be perfect. There was no room for error. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the scene from earlier that evening. The way they had laughed as they walked out the door, Kelly hanging onto that man, as if Blake didn't even exist. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the ease with which they had discarded him, as if all those years together had meant nothing. They thought they were untouchable, that they could walk all over him without consequence. But they were wrong. Blake was going to show them just how wrong they were. By the time dawn's first light seeped through the basement's tiny window, Blake was ready. He climbed the stairs back to the main floor, pausing at the top to listen. The house was still silent, empty. The bed upstairs, untouched. He had spent the entire night preparing, and now, with the sun rising, all that was left was to wait. He made himself a pot of coffee, the simple act grounding him momentarily. The familiar smell filled the kitchen, a stark contrast to the dark thoughts swirling in his mind. He poured a cup, black and strong, and took it to the living room where he sat in his usual chair. The TV was still on, showing a rerun of some old sitcom, but Blake wasn't paying attention. His mind was miles away, focused on what was to come. Kelly and her lover would return eventually, thinking they could walk back into this house as if nothing had happened. But when they did, they would find a different Blake waiting for them. Not the passive, quiet man they had dismissed so easily, but someone else. Someone who had spent the night meticulously planning their downfall. As he sipped his coffee, Blake felt a strange calm wash over him. He wasn't afraid of what he was about to do. In fact, it felt inevitable, like the natural conclusion to everything that had happened. They had made their choices, and now he was making his. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, each one bringing him closer to the moment when they would return, when the plan he had set in motion would be executed. Blake finished his coffee, set the cup down on the table, and leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. It didn't matter. He had all the time in the world, and when the moment arrived, he would be ready. Blake had been waiting for this moment, his senses sharp, his emotions locked behind a wall of cold resolve. As the black car pulled into the driveway, the first light of dawn cast long shadows across the yard. He heard the engine cut off and the sound of car doors opening. The night had been long, but he felt no fatigue. Instead, a strange calmness had settled over him, like the quiet before a storm. The front door creaked open, and the stranger swaggered in first, his footsteps heavy, followed by Kelly, who seemed almost to float beside him, still caught in the afterglow of their night out. Their laughter filled the entryway, but it died as soon as they stepped into the kitchen and saw Blake sitting at the table, casually sipping his coffee as if it were any other day. "Good morning, guys," Blake said, his voice steady, almost cheerful. He looked up from his cup, meeting their surprised stares with an unnerving calm. "How was your night?" Kelly froze, her smirk faltering as she searched his face for something familiar, something that would tell her everything was still under control. But what she found instead was a man she no longer recognized, someone far removed from the passive husband she had taken for granted. The stranger, still riding high on his own arrogance, scoffed. "What's with the look, loser?" he sneered, stepping forward. "Didn't get enough sleep?" Blake didn't answer. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, then set the cup down with a quiet clink that seemed to echo in the tense silence. The stranger, mistaking Blake's calm for weakness, smirked and moved closer, his swagger undiminished. But in the blink of an eye, Blake exploded into action. His fist shot out, connecting with the stranger's jaw with a force that sent him reeling backward. The sound of the impact was sharp, followed by the dull thud of the man hitting the floor, his bravado shattered along with his jaw. Kelly screamed, a sound of pure shock, but it was cut short as Blake turned to her, his eyes cold and unforgiving. She backed away, instinctively putting distance between them, her earlier confidence evaporating in the face of this new, dangerous Blake. "Blake, what the hell are you doing?" she stammered, her voice trembling. This wasn't the man she had expected to find. This wasn't the man she had left behind just hours ago. Blake took a step toward her, his expression unreadable. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice low and menacing. He glanced down at the stranger, who was groaning on the floor, clutching his jaw in pain. "Both of you." Kelly looked from Blake to the man on the floor, her mind racing. "Blake, please, you don't have to do this. Let's just talk." "No." Blake cut her off, his voice firm. "We're done talking. You made your choice. Now it's my turn." He moved quickly, grabbing the stranger by the collar and hauling him to his feet. The man tried to resist, but the blow to his jaw had left him disoriented, his movements sluggish. Blake shoved him toward the door, then turned to Kelly, who was still frozen in place, fear etched across her face. "Blake, please," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Shut up," Blake snapped, his patience wearing thin. "I don't want your apologies. I want you to understand what you've done." He grabbed her arm, not roughly, but firmly enough that she knew there was no point in resisting. With the stranger stumbling ahead of them, Blake led the way down the hall, toward the basement door. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest as they descended the stairs, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. This wasn't a nightmare she could wake up from. This was real, and Blake was serious. The basement was dimly lit, the shadows long and menacing. Blake pushed the stranger into a chair he had prepared earlier, securing him with the chains that had once been used for something as mundane as a project. Now they had a darker purpose. The man groaned, still dazed, as Blake tightened the chains, making sure he couldn't move. Kelly stood by the stairs, trembling, as Blake turned to her. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to another chair across the room. She obeyed, her legs weak, collapsing into the chair as if the strength had been drained from her body. Blake walked over to a small table where he had laid out the tools he might need. He picked up a length of duct tape, tearing off a strip with a loud rip that made Kelly flinch. He crossed the room and roughly taped the stranger's mouth shut, silencing the groans of protest. Stepping back, Blake surveyed his work, his heart pounding in his chest, though his expression remained cold. This was it. This was the moment he had prepared for all night. The moment where everything would change. He turned to Kelly, who was staring at him, wide-eyed, a mix of fear and disbelief in her gaze. "You wanted excitement," Blake said, his voice soft, almost sad. Well, here it is. The basement was cold, the air thick with tension. Kelly, bound to a chair in the center of the room, shivered uncontrollably. The chains rattled as the stranger pulled at them, his movements desperate and frantic. He had woken fully to the gravity of his situation and was now acutely aware of the danger he was in. Blake stood in front of them, the dim light bulb casting long, eerie shadows that flickered with every movement. Blake held a knife in his hand, its blade reflecting the harsh light overhead. He looked at the stranger, then at Kelly, his expression unreadable. You thought you could just waltz into my life, take what's mine, and walk away? Blake's voice was calm, but it carried an edge of quiet fury. You thought there wouldn't be consequences? The stranger tried to speak, but the words were muffled by the duct tape that covered his mouth. He thrashed against the chains, his eyes wide with fear, trying to bargain with his eyes. Blake stepped closer to him, his movements deliberate. He brought the knife down slowly, making the first cut, a shallow, deliberate line across the man's chest. The blade sliced through the fabric of his shirt, leaving a thin, red line of blood. The stranger's muffled scream echoed in the confined space, a sound that seemed to satisfy Blake's need for retribution. This is just the beginning, Blake said, his voice low but clear. He turned his gaze to Kelly, who was watching with horror-stricken eyes. You both betrayed me, and now you're going to pay. Blake walked over to Kelly, the knife still glinting in his hand. She flinched as he approached, her eyes darting between the knife and the man on the floor. Bitch, you chose him over me, Blake whispered, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. You made a choice, and now you're going to watch him suffer. Kelly's tears began to flow, her face flushed with fear. Blake, please, she pleaded, her voice trembling. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. We can talk. Blake cut her off with a harsh gesture. No more talking, he said firmly. He turned his attention back to the stranger, who was now gasping through his nose, his body trembling. Blake knelt beside him, examining the cut he had made. You think this is bad? He asked, his voice cold. You have no idea what's coming next. He stood up and walked over to the workbench, where he had laid out a few tools earlier, pliers, a hammer, and some heavy-duty wire. He picked up the pliers, holding them up so the stranger could see them. The man's eyes widened in panic as he realized what they were for. Blake turned back to Kelly, who was sobbing quietly. You wanted excitement, he said, his voice almost gentle now, though it was laced with menace. Well, this is what it looks like. He approached the stranger again, his face set in a grim expression. He used the pliers to grip the edge of the cut, squeezing just enough to make the stranger squirm in pain. The man's muffled cries grew louder, but they were still cut off by the duct tape. Blake's hands were steady, his movements precise as he applied pressure. Kelly watched in horror, her cries blending with the stranger's muffled screams. Blake, please stop, she begged, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't you. We can work this out. I'll do anything. Blake ignored her. His focus was entirely on the stranger now. He released the pliers and picked up the hammer. He raised it slowly, letting the anticipation build before bringing it down with a sharp, decisive motion. The blow was aimed at the floor beside the stranger, but the sound was enough to make him flinch violently. Blake placed the hammer back down, then walked over to Kelly, crouching in front of her. Do you see what you've done? He asked, his voice low but intense. You chose him. Now you have to watch him suffer. This is your fault. Kelly shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Blake, please, she whispered. I'm begging you. Let him go. He's just a guy. This is crazy. Blake's expression hardened. Crazy, he echoed, standing up. You think this is crazy? You think what you did was just a mistake? This is reality, Kelly. This is what happens when you cross me. He turned back to the stranger, who was now sobbing silently, his body trembling with each agonizing breath. Blake reached for the knife again, the blade glinting ominously. He made another cut, a little deeper this time, drawing another scream from the man. Blake returned to Kelly, his face set in a determined mask. This is your nightmare, he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. And it's only just beginning. The basement fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Kelly's sobs and the stranger's pained gasps. Blake stood over them, his emotions a turbulent mix of anger, satisfaction, and something darker, more primal. He knew this was just the start of what he had planned. The real nightmare was only beginning. Hours had passed, but time felt irrelevant. The man on the floor, who had once been so full of bravado, was now barely conscious. His body lay limp, his cries reduced to feeble whimpers. Kelly sat tied to the chair, her face devoid of emotion, her eyes staring blankly into the distance. It was as if her mind had retreated to a place far removed from the horror unfolding around her. Blake stood over them, the knife still gripped in his hand, its blade slick with blood. His breathing was ragged, each breath coming in heavy, uneven gasps. He had envisioned this moment countless times, imagining it would bring him a sense of closure or satisfaction. But now, standing amidst the remnants of his rage, he felt a profound emptiness. The anger that had fueled him had dissipated, leaving behind a hollow space. He looked down at the knife, the metal catching the dim light of the basement. For a moment, he felt a wave of nausea. The harsh reality of what he had done, what he had become, crashed over him. The anger that had seemed so justified now felt foreign and meaningless. Blake dropped the knife, the clang of metal against concrete sounding like a judgment in itself. The knife rolled a few feet away, coming to a rest against the wall. The sound of its fall was stark and final, reverberating through the basement and breaking the oppressive silence. "This isn't me," Blake muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. He said it more to himself than to anyone else, as if trying to convince himself that there was still a part of him that wasn't consumed by this darkness. He turned slowly to Kelly, his gaze meeting hers. Her eyes were wide but unseeing, as if she had already detached herself from reality. Blake saw the woman he had once loved, the woman who had shattered his world. But instead of the burning hatred he expected to feel, he was overwhelmed by a sudden surge of pity. For Kelly, for the stranger, and for himself. Blake's hands trembled as he approached Kelly. He crouched in front of her, his expression conflicted. "I thought this would make me feel better," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought it would be enough to know that you were suffering. But now, all I feel is emptiness." Kelly blinked, her gaze flickering towards him for the first time. Her eyes were wet with tears, but she remained silent. She had no words, no excuses that could reach through the fog of Blake's disillusionment. Blake stood up abruptly, the weight of his actions settling heavily on his shoulders. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the basement stairs. The sound of his footsteps was a sharp contrast to the quiet of the basement. Each step felt like a step away from the man he had been, and toward an uncertain future. He climbed the stairs slowly, the creaking of the steps the only sound in the otherwise silent house. At the top of the stairs, he paused, glancing back down into the basement. The door loomed in front of him, a threshold between the life he had known and whatever lay beyond. As he reached for the door handle, Blake took one last look at the basement, at the two people who had once been a part of his life and now represented everything he wanted to leave behind. The door closed with a soft click behind him, cutting off the sight and the sounds from below. Blake leaned against the door for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't know what would come next, what path he would follow. But he was certain of one thing. This was the end of a chapter. The finality of the door closing behind him felt symbolic. He moved through the house, each room feeling like a ghost of his former life. The walls seemed to close in, heavy with memories and regrets. He walked out into the morning light, the world outside starkly different from the darkness he had just left behind. The sun was rising, casting a new light on everything. Blake took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. He felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Leaving Kelly and the stranger behind, he was free from the immediate consequence of his actions. But he was also faced with the daunting reality of what came next. As he walked away from the house, Blake realized that sometimes the most brutal revenge isn't in the act itself, but in the realization of its futility. The true horror lay in understanding that the pain and destruction were not a resolution, but a beginning of something even more unsettling. He had hoped to find closure, but instead, he was left with the harsh truth that some wounds can never be healed, and some paths, once taken, lead to a darkness that's impossible to escape. Days turned into weeks, and the silence that followed the night of violence was oppressive. Blake moved out of the house, packing his belongings with a mechanical efficiency. He had already filed for divorce before leaving, ensuring that everything was as impersonal as possible. The house, once a symbol of a shared life, now felt like a relic of a past he wanted to leave behind. Blake's departure was abrupt. He didn't tell Kelly he was leaving. He simply packed his bags, took a final look at the life he was abandoning, and walked out. He was determined to sever every connection to his old life. The city where he had lived for years faded behind him as he settled into a new place, a small apartment in an unfamiliar town. He adopted a new identity, one that allowed him to blend in with the crowd, to be anyone but himself. Meanwhile, Kelly and her lover were left to grapple with the consequences of their choices. The once vibrant home was now a place of strained silence and broken dreams. The stranger had been released from the hospital, but the physical and emotional scars of that night had left him a shadow of his former self. His bravado was gone, replaced by a shell-shocked demeanor that matched Kelly's own sense of despair. The couple's interactions were strained, filled with guilt and fear. They avoided talking about the events of that night, hoping that silence would somehow make it less real. But the guilt clung to them, a constant reminder of the price they had paid. Their relationship, once driven by passion and excitement, was now plagued by a haunting regret that made every moment feel like a punishment. Kelly would often sit alone in the dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the space where Blake's presence had once been. The house, now too quiet, seemed to amplify her thoughts. The empty space where Blake's things used to be was a constant reminder of the life she had destroyed. She tried to focus on rebuilding her life, but every attempt felt hollow. She would catch herself replaying the events of that night, each memory a fresh wound. Her lover, meanwhile, struggled with his own demons. The physical pain from the injuries had healed, but the psychological damage was more persistent. He avoided leaving the house, not because of any physical ailment, but because he couldn't face the world outside. Every noise, every shadow, seemed like a reminder of what had happened. The bravado he had shown in the past was replaced by a profound sense of defeat. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of their new existence became a monotonous cycle. Kelly tried to put on a brave face, pretending that everything was normal, but the facade never quite held. The guilt was a constant companion, gnawing at her with every failed attempt to move on. The laughter and joy that once filled the house were now replaced by a somber, lingering silence. Blake, in contrast, found solace in his new anonymity. The bustling city streets, the unfamiliar faces, all seemed to offer a kind of freedom he hadn't known before. He immersed himself in his new life, taking on a new job and establishing a new routine. The memories of his past life seemed to blur with time, becoming a distant echo rather than a constant reality. The choice to leave them behind, to walk away from the confrontation and the pain, had brought Blake a strange form of peace. In the quiet of his new apartment, he found solace in the simplicity of a life unburdened by the past. He realized that the true revenge wasn't in the actions he had taken, but in the power he had reclaimed by choosing to live a different life, free from the chains of his old existence. As the months passed, Blake found himself adjusting to this new chapter. He had regained a sense of control over his life, one that had been missing for years. He wasn't sure if he would ever fully escape the shadows of his past, but he knew he had made a choice that allowed him to move forward, to find a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Kelly and her lover, meanwhile, continued to live with the consequences of their actions. The past couldn't be erased, and the weight of their decisions was something they would carry with them. The silent punishment they endured was a reminder of the choices they had made, a constant shadow over their attempts to rebuild their lives. Blake understood now that the most profound form of revenge was not in exacting suffering, but in choosing a different path, one that allowed him to reclaim his sense of self. In that choice, he had found a kind of freedom, a peace that eluded those who remained trapped in the aftermath of their actions.